Imagine walking into a store on a regular day, just looking to buy a few things. You're polite, you're minding your own business, but the moment you step inside, all eyes are on you. The tension in the air is almost palpable. The store owner glares, whispers to an employee, and before you know it, they're on the phone with the police. Why? Not because you've done anything wrong, but simply because of the color of your skin. In this story, that's exactly what happens. A black customer becomes the target of baseless suspicion by a biased store owner, who jumps to conclusions without any evidence. The call to the police is made, the situation escalates, and just as the customer starts to feel the weight of injustice bearing down, the unexpected happens. The officer who arrives isn't just anyone, it's someone with a deep, personal connection to the person being targeted. What happens when prejudice meets an undeniable truth? When assumptions are shattered right there in the store? Stick around, because this story will leave you questioning how far kindness, connection, and justice can go in challenging bias and standing up for what's right. As the sound of the phone call echoed through the small, cramped store, the customer could feel the weight of it. He had been here countless times before. The aisles were familiar, the dim lighting was comforting, and the staff had always been friendly until today. The way the store owner's eyes darted toward him, the whispering, the sudden rush to grab the phone, it didn't make sense. His heart rate began to quicken, his palms becoming clammy. It wasn't even that he was doing anything suspicious. He was simply browsing, checking out a few items he'd had his eye on. Yet, here he was, standing in the middle of an unspoken accusation, waiting for the worst. He tried to shrug it off, convincing himself it was just a misunderstanding. Maybe the store owner was having a bad day, maybe it wasn't about him at all. But when the shopkeeper started muttering under his breath, he couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread. The words "call the police" floated through the air like a hammer, and before he knew it, the phone was already in the owner's hand. A chill ran down his spine. He had experienced this before, in other places, at other times. It wasn't the first time he'd been singled out. But this time felt different, more personal somehow. The store was quiet now, a thick silence hanging over the scene. He glanced around, noticing how the few remaining customers seemed to keep their distance. No one said anything, no one did anything, but their eyes told a different story. It was the kind of silence that made you feel smaller, like an invisible spotlight was shining right on you. From the moment the police officer walked through the door, the tension in the room shifted again. The store owner's expression had changed from cautious to relieved, almost smug, as if he had been proven right. The officer, a man in his 30s, was dressed in a crisp uniform. His boots clicked on the tile floor as he walked toward the counter, his gaze quickly sweeping over the store and landing on the customer. But something strange happened. The officer's expression faltered for just a second, just long enough for the customer to notice. A brief flicker of recognition crossed the officer's face before he wiped it away. The officer wasn't a stranger. In fact, he was someone the customer knew well. They had grown up in the same neighborhood, attended the same schools, and even shared a few mutual friends. The officer had always been a quiet kid, smart and dedicated. They had crossed paths a few times since then, always with polite nods and brief hellos. They were acquaintances, sure, but nothing more than that. So, why did the officer seem so distant, so guarded? The tension in the room thickened. The store owner, eager to explain his actions, started talking in quick, rushed sentences, laying out his reasons for calling the police. He spoke in vague terms, only mentioning that the customer looked out of place, that there had been concerns about his behavior, though none of it made sense. The officer's gaze shifted between the customer and the store owner, his posture stiff. The silence grew unbearable. He hadn't spoken yet, hadn't even acknowledged the customer directly, but it was clear he was weighing something, an internal struggle of sorts. The customer stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of it all. He was used to being watched, used to being scrutinized in ways that felt unjust, but this was different. This wasn't just a stranger calling the shots, this was someone who knew him. Someone who knew he wasn't troubled. As the officer took a step closer, the customer couldn't help but wonder, what was going through his mind? Was he going to side with the store owner? Was he going to follow through with whatever bias had led to this call? Or was he going to step in and challenge the injustice, the unfairness that was hanging in the air like smoke? In that moment, 1,000 thoughts raced through the customer's head, each one more disorienting than the last. His mind flashed back to all the times he had experienced this kind of treatment before, each time more hurtful than the last. He thought of the countless microaggressions, the whispers, the sideways glances. He thought of the people who had looked at him as if he didn't belong. But this time was different. This time, it wasn't just some nameless face calling the shots. It was someone who knew him, someone who had shared experiences, someone who knew better than to judge someone based on appearance. The officer stopped in front of him, their eyes locking for a brief moment. Neither of them spoke. The customer's heart pounded in his chest, and the store owner's voice faded into the background, becoming an irrelevant hum. All he could think about was the officer's next move. Would he side with his friend? Would he be the kind of person who let bias slide, simply because it was easier? Or would he be the person he had always known, the person who saw beyond skin color, beyond assumptions? The officer looked back at the store owner, then back at the customer, his jaw tightening ever so slightly. For a brief second, it felt like time had stopped. The room was still, the air thick with unspoken words. The customer's gaze never wavered from the officer's, silently pleading for understanding, for fairness. The officer seemed to hesitate, his hand hovering near his radio as if unsure of the next step. The store owner, sensing the shift in the air, spoke up again. His voice was louder this time, more insistent. He's causing trouble. I've had my eye on him all day, and I know he's up to something. I'm just trying to run a business here. I can't have people like that in my store. The officer's face twitched at the accusation. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked back at the customer one last time, his eyes searching, trying to make sense of the situation. The moment stretched on, each passing second feeling like a lifetime. In that split second, a decision needed to be made. Would the officer step in and challenge the store owner's assumptions? Would he refuse to let this man be treated unjustly? Or would he follow the path of least resistance, allowing the biases to dictate the outcome? And just as the officer finally opened his mouth to speak, the door to the store swung open with a loud chime. A new figure stepped in, someone unexpected, someone with a presence that commanded attention. The tension in the room shifted again, but this time, it wasn't just about the customer or the officer. Something bigger was unfolding. Would this new arrival tip the scales in favor of fairness, or would the story take another, darker turn? The door swung open with a jarring chime, a sound that instantly cut through the heavy tension in the room. Everyone's eyes shifted, all attention now focused on the newcomer who had entered the store without hesitation. The figure was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with an air of confidence that instantly commanded attention. The moment he stepped in, the atmosphere changed. The store, once filled with the unspoken weight of judgment and accusation, seemed to exhale a collective breath. The officer, still standing in the same spot, turned toward the door. For a moment, recognition flickered across his face. His expression shifted again, this time to something more guarded, more careful. The store owner's eyes widened, a look of both confusion and discomfort creeping onto his face. It wasn't clear what this new figure's presence meant, but whatever it was enough to shift the balance of power in the room. The customer, too, felt something shift within himself. He had been standing there, waiting for something, anything that would make this moment right. He had no idea who this person was or what role they played in this unfolding drama, but he could feel it in his gut. This person wasn't just an observer. There was something about them, something that made the store owner uneasy, something that gave the officer pause. The newcomer's eyes scanned the room quickly, taking in the scene before him. His gaze briefly met the officer's, then shifted to the store owner. Finally, his eyes landed on the customer. Without a word, he took a few measured steps forward, his presence almost magnetic, demanding respect without having to say anything. The store owner cleared his throat, as if suddenly unsure of himself. "Can I help you?" The store owner asked, his voice more faltering now than it had been moments before. The newcomer didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked around the store, his eyes lingering on the shelves and aisles. It was almost as though he was making sure everything was in its place, or perhaps taking stock of situation unfolding in front of him. The officer, still standing by, seemed to be waiting for a signal, something to indicate how to proceed. Finally, the newcomer turned his attention back to the store owner. His tone was calm, but there was an edge to it that made the room grow even quieter. "Why don't you tell me what's going on here?" he asked, his voice low but firm. "Why is the police involved?" The store owner hesitated, shifting uncomfortably on his feet. He opened his mouth, as if ready to defend his actions, but the words didn't come out as easily as they had before. Instead, his eyes flickered to the officer, as if looking for reassurance. The officer, who had been silent since the arrival of the newcomer, seemed to tense up at the question. He shifted his weight, but didn't speak. The newcomer's gaze never wavered from the store owner. It was clear now that he wasn't just asking to be polite, he was pressing for answers. And somehow, his mere presence made the situation feel less like a confrontation and more like a reckoning. "I called the police," the store owner finally said, his voice faltering. "This man, he's been acting suspiciously. I've had problems in the past with people like him. I can't risk anything happening in my store." The words felt rehearsed, like a script the store owner had practiced in his mind long before today. But they didn't sit right. Not anymore. The customer, standing just a few feet away, could feel the sting of the accusation, but now, with this new figure in the room, he found his voice. "He's lying," the customer said, his voice steady but full of frustration. "I haven't done anything wrong. I've been shopping here for years. There's no reason for this." The store owner opened his mouth to protest, but the newcomer cut him off with a single, pointed gesture. "Is that true?" the newcomer asked, turning to the officer. His voice was even, but there was an unmistakable challenge in it. The officer, still silent, looked down at the floor. The tension in the room grew thick, palpable. The customer could feel his heart pounding in his chest. The officer was his friend, had been for years. But in this moment, it didn't feel like friendship mattered. It felt like loyalty to a system, a way of thinking, was pulling the officer away from doing the right thing. And it terrified the customer. The officer finally looked up, his eyes locking with the newcomer's. It was clear there was some unspoken connection between them, some shared history that neither of them was ready to reveal. But the weight of that look said more than words ever could. The newcomer took a step closer to the officer, his voice low but strong. "What's your call, officer? Do you see what's happening here?" The officer hesitated, his hand still hovering near his radio. He glanced at the store owner, then at the customer, his brow furrowed. He wasn't sure what to do, and the silence stretched on longer than anyone could bear. Then, with a heavy sigh, the officer spoke. "I don't know what's going on here," he said slowly, his voice uncertain. "But I don't think this should be happening." The store owner's face turned red. "What are you talking about? You can't just..." But the officer didn't let him finish. "I think you owe him an apology," he said, his words measured but firm. "And I think I need to speak with you outside." The store owner stood there, speechless, his face contorting with disbelief. For the first time, it seemed as though he realized he wasn't going to win this battle. He was caught, his biases laid bare for everyone to see. The officer turned to the customer, offering a look of silent apology, then nodded toward the door. The newcomer stepped back, giving the officer and the store owner space. The tension between them was palpable, but now, it was shifting. The officer wasn't standing in judgment anymore. He wasn't the one wielding authority in this moment. The newcomer had turned the tables. And as the officer and the store owner stepped outside to talk, the customer stood there for a moment, breathing in the strange calm that had taken over the room. The weight that had been on his shoulders for so long, this invisible burden of suspicion, of bias, of being judged without reason, was still there, but it felt different now. Lighter somehow. The man who had entered the store had done what no one else had, he had stepped in. He had forced the officer to reckon with what was happening. And in doing so, he had created a space for truth, for fairness, to find its way to the surface. The officer and the store owner returned a few minutes later, the conversation clearly over. The officer's expression was different now, more resolute, his posture straighter. The store owner, on the other hand, looked defeated, like the air had been knocked out of him. "Sir," the officer said to the customer, "I owe you an apology. This situation shouldn't have happened." The customer nodded, though it didn't erase the sting of what had happened. He still felt the weight of the store owner's initial accusation, the quiet shame of being treated as less than because of something he couldn't control. But the officer's words, however simple, carried weight. "And you," the officer continued, turning toward the store owner, "should be more careful next time. Assumptions like that are dangerous." The store owner said nothing, his eyes focused on the ground. The customer could see the shift in the room. Something had changed, and it wasn't just about what happened today. It was about the deeper issues of bias and prejudice that had been exposed in this small, seemingly insignificant moment. The customer took a deep breath, feeling the tension release, the anger that had been simmering inside him for so long finally starting to ebb away. There was still work to be done. There were still systems to be challenged, biases to confront, but this moment the small victory felt like something important. As the officer and the store owner left the store, the newcomer lingered for a moment longer, turning to the customer. He didn't say anything at first, just nodded in understanding. "Thank you," the customer said quietly. The newcomer smiled, a knowing look in his eyes. "You're not alone," he said simply. "Never forget that." And with that, he turned and walked out, leaving the customer alone in the now quiet store. The lingering sense of unease was still there, but it felt different now. It wasn't about fear anymore, it was about hope. About the possibility that change, however small, was still possible. And in that moment, as the customer stood there, watching the door swing closed behind him, he realized that sometimes, the fight for justice doesn't come with grand gestures or sweeping speeches. Sometimes, it comes with quiet moments of recognition, of standing together, and of pushing back against the things that try to keep us apart.